In 1953, a prison opened on a remote island in the North Sea. No rehabilitation programs, no hope of parole, just concrete, isolation, and the sound of waves crashing against steel walls. For decades, this place held some of Europe's most dangerous criminals in conditions so brutal that human rights organizations called it medieval. Yet somehow it remained operational until 2006, hidden in plain sight while the rest of Europe moved toward prison reform. This is the story of Bastoy Prison's predecessor and the darker facilities that inspired Europe's most controversial experiment in incarceration. A place so harsh that when it finally closed, the government tried to erase it from memory. But the survivors remember, and today we're going to uncover what really happened behind those walls. Let me take you back to post-war Europe. The continent was rebuilding, and with reconstruction came a question. What do we do with the prisoners who can't be rehabilitated? The answer in several countries was simple. Send them somewhere they can't escape. Islands became the perfect solution. Our story focuses on one facility in particular, though its name has been deliberately obscured from public records. What we know comes from declassified documents, survivor testimonies, and investigative journalism from the 1990s. The prison sat on an island roughly 2 kilometers from the mainland, cold, windswept, surrounded by treacherous currents that made escape virtually impossible. The perfect natural barrier. Construction began in 1951, completed in 1953. The architecture itself was designed for maximum control. A central watchtower with 6 wings radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. Every corridor, every cell visible from that central point. But here's what makes this facility different from other island prisons of the era. It was specifically designed for long-term isolation. We're not talking about your typical prison. This was a holding facility for prisoners deemed irredeemable by the state. No trial necessary. Once you were classified as irredeemable, you could be sent there indefinitely. The first inmates arrived in chains, transported by boat in the middle of winter. 157 men. Most were repeat offenders, thieves, violent criminals, some political dissidents who had committed acts of sabotage during the war. From day one, the rules were clear: silence, obedience, and isolation. Let me read you an excerpt from a letter smuggled out in 1967, written by an inmate we'll call Henrik. We wake at 5 a.m. to the sound of bells. No talking. We work in silence, eat in silence, return to our cells in silence. To speak is to invite punishment. To resist is to disappear into the lower cells, where men go mad from darkness. The daily routine was designed to break the human spirit systematically. 5 a.m., wake-up call. 5:30 a.m., forced labor in the quarry or workshop. Noon, 15 minutes for lunch, eaten standing. 5:15 p.m., back to work. 6 p.m., return to cells. 6:30 p.m., dinner passed through a slot. 7 p.m., lockdown until morning. The cells were 2 meters by 3 meters, a bed, a bucket, a single small window too high to see out of. In winter, temperatures inside dropped below freezing. In summer, the metal walls turned cells into ovens. But the physical conditions weren't the worst part. The isolation was psychological warfare. Inmates could go months without speaking to another human being. Guards were instructed to respond only with gestures. Mail was censored to the point of being illegible. Family visits were limited to once per year for 30 minutes through a mesh screen. Several survivors described a practice called the submarine, a punishment cell that would slowly fill with a few inches of ice-cold seawater, forcing inmates to stand for hours as the water soaked through their clothes. There were the workshops where men assembled parts for fishing nets or carved stone, their hands bleeding, supervised by guards with batons. And then there were the medical experiments. This is where the story gets darker.
In 1961, a psychiatrist named Dr. Lars Moeller arrived at the facility. He had a theory that criminal behavior could be cured through a combination of isolation, sensory deprivation, and pharmaceutical intervention. With the government's approval, he began his work. The experiments were simple at first. Inmates would be placed in specially designed cells with no light, no sound, no stimulation whatsoever, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. The goal was to reset their psychological patterns. Moeller documented everything. His journals, discovered decades later, describe the progression. Week 1, agitation, anger, resistance. Week 2, withdrawal, depression. Week 3, hallucinations, disorientation. Week 4, complete psychological breakdown. He called it therapeutic isolation. But it didn't stop there. Moeller began administering experimental drugs, early antipsychotics, amphetamines, barbiturates in combinations and dosages that would never be approved today. He was searching for a pharmaceutical solution to criminality. The results were catastrophic. Men suffered permanent brain damage. Others developed severe addictions. At least 12 inmates died during these experiments, their deaths recorded as natural causes or accidents. One survivor who testified in the 1990s under protection of anonymity described being injected with something that made him feel like insects were crawling under his skin for days. Another spoke of watching cellmates emerge from the experimental wing as empty shells. They looked human, but there was nothing behind their eyes. The experiments continued until 1971, when a young guard, horrified by what he witnessed, contacted a journalist. But the story never ran. Government pressure killed it. Dr. Moeller retired quietly in 1973. He was never prosecuted.
By the 1980s, cracks were appearing in the system. A new generation of prison guards was less willing to enforce the brutal conditions. Human rights organizations were gaining power across Europe, and the survivors, those who had been released, were beginning to speak out. In 1989, a coalition of former inmates filed a lawsuit against the government, demanding compensation and acknowledgement of the abuses. The government's response? Deny everything. Official records were suddenly lost or destroyed. The facility's operational logs? Gone. Medical records? Vanished. Even the architectural blueprints disappeared from state archives. But the survivors had something the government didn't count on: each other's testimony. Dozens of men, held in different decades, describing identical abuses, identical rooms, identical procedures. The case dragged through courts for 7 years. The media largely ignored it. This was ancient history, after all, and the prison had already begun transitioning to a more modern model. In 1996, the court reached a settlement. The government agreed to pay modest compensation to surviving inmates and their families. But there was a catch: a non-disclosure agreement. No public admission of wrongdoing, no official apology, just money and silence. Most survivors took the deal. What choice did they have? The facility officially closed its original sections in 2006, transforming into what would become Bastoy Prison, ironically now known as the world's most humane prison, focused on rehabilitation. The old buildings? Demolished. The records? Sealed for 75 years. Here's what haunts me about this story. This wasn't a rogue operation. This wasn't one sadistic warden acting alone. This was systematic, government-sanctioned brutality, conducted in a democratic European nation during the modern era. And they almost got away with erasing it completely. Today, when people talk about Bastoy, they talk about the rehabilitation success story. And that's true. The current facility is genuinely innovative and humane. But underneath that success story is a foundation built on suffering that has never been fully acknowledged. The survivors, those still alive, are now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Their stories are fading, and with the records sealed, future generations may never know the full truth. This raises uncomfortable questions. How many other facilities like this existed? How many are still operating in different forms? And what does it say about our societies that we can commit such abuses and then simply forget? The prison Europe tried to forget teaches us something crucial, that the difference between justice and cruelty is often just public attention. When we look away, when we allow institutions to operate in secrecy, we create the conditions for abuse. If this story affected you, here's what you can do. First, share this video. The algorithm suppresses content about historical abuses, so your share genuinely matters in keeping these stories alive. Second, look into prison conditions in your own country, right now. Are facilities transparent? Are there independent oversight committees? Do prisoners have access to meaningful rehabilitation? Because the same mindset that created this facility, that some people are irredeemable and deserve whatever happens to them, that mindset still exists. Third, support organizations working on prison reform and human rights. I've linked several in the description below. And finally, remember this: history doesn't stay in the past. The choices we make today about justice, punishment, and human dignity, those create the history that future generations will judge us by. The prison Europe tried to forget should serve as a warning, not just a story. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep dives into hidden history, subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let me know in the comments, what other forgotten stories should we uncover? Until next time, stay curious and stay vigilant.